All right, here's another video from weldingtipsandtricks.com. I'm going to be doing a little TIG welding overhead today, and it's just kind of a follow-up in a walking the cup and not walking the cup video I did a while back, and I wasn't able to really talk about walking the cup and show it a whole lot because I just had one weld to do. And so in between now and the time I get a hold of some pipe and can show it further, I'm going to expand on it a little bit here and show two passes on an overhead T-joint. So basically you have to prop the cup in there in that nook and wiggle it back and forth, and how much you wiggle it depends on how wide a bead you want, how big a wire you're using, what kind of joint it is, etc. Generally a first pass is a pretty narrow wiggle, and a lot of times you just leave the wire in the puddle. So what we're going to do now is we're going to tack up a joint, get it ready. This is some 3/16 or 1/4 inch. And a little trick for tacking here, I like to use when there's a switch on the torch or even with a foot pedal, is setting the machine about twice what you would normally weld and then just hitting it with all that amperage all at once. I've got a little switch on the torch here, and you see how quickly that just blasts it together. And if you're just, if it's thick enough and you're not going to melt the corner away, and you're want to save some time, it's a good way. You can also blow holes and get in trouble this way, so be very careful. But that's how a switch on a torch can come in really handy if you're having to do lots of tacks on something and you can get it dialed in. You see, I'm going to light up here really quickly on some MIG beads that I did on a video 1 or 2 ago, and you see how big of a puddle it makes quickly. Just only about a second there, and it makes about a 1/4 inch or better puddle, so it's pretty hot. Okay. Moving on, you can see past videos on this tacking method explaining it more and how to set the machine, but let's just take a few dry runs here on the overhead TIG. Here's one way of holding the TIG torch. You got to be able to reach that button on this particular thing because I'm not using an amperage control. I'm just presetting the amperage at about 120 amps or so. And so I'm going to have to hold that button. So there's one way of holding it, and also a common way of holding it, especially for pipe welders, is up like this. And you get what you do is you wiggle that cup and you try to move it the same distance each time, and it makes for a pretty precise looking weld. You can also do it freehanding. You don't have to walk the cup. And in fact, this joint, might actually go better, but I'm just going to show walking the cup just because that's what I'm talking about today. You can drag your finger along. The metal gets hot if you do that. If you don't have a TIG finger like I've got here, it's going to be a problem. You'll have to tape an old glove finger or whatever on your finger, and because it gets really hot. That's one benefit of walking the cup. It keeps your hand off the metal, and you just prop that ceramic cup against there. So again, a little dry run here. See, I'm not going anywhere now. I've got to intentionally kind of scoot. Every time you wiggle it, it breaks the tension a little bit and lets it move with a little forward pressure, just lets it move, and it makes for a very precise little weave. We'll do a few other little methods here showing how you might prop up here and weld it. You see this thing is kind of flimsy. It's wiggling around. That's another benefit. With propping on that cup, it kind of steadies the piece up in this particular case. I could also just rest this thing just like this and scoot it along. That would work also. One of the main things I've got to worry about is arc length. It needs a tight arc length and not an extreme torch angle. So I've got the electrode extended out an amount here that I can reach into that root and still have a pretty tight arc length when I get a puddle in there. So getting ready to light up, just holding the wire nearby and pull the trigger, get a puddle going, and then dip that rod in there and leave it and wiggle that torch, and that's how it goes. You'll see a close-up of that in just a second. I'm on my knees here just because a lot of this stuff, these kind of welds overhead, you're not particularly comfortable, so I purposely set it down on my knees to use the fingertip switch just to show you that that's necessary sometimes. And this is how the puddle looks basically. Just a slight wiggle, because you don't want that thing really wide. That'll give you a real shallow throat. Just a slight wiggle to keep it going. And you can use a narrow wiggle and wiggle it faster it just depends on your preference and what the end bead, you know, if you want really, really tight ripples and a really narrow bead, you wiggle it just a little bit side to side, but faster. And if you're a little wider, you can go a little slower. Now, it's a good idea to learn how to use your left hand. If you're walking the cup or resting the cup like this, it's hard to weld that very end because there's nothing there. So I'm just going to weld to the end, swapping hands like this. It's a good idea to weld intentionally left hand sometimes just to stay in practice. I don't do it near enough. It comes back to me pretty quickly, but it feels awkward for the first few minutes. Again, just barely, just wiggling the, you can just barely wiggle that cup, keep the bead narrow. You can leave the wire in or you can dip it in and out. If you really, really want to make sure that that root pass penetrates all the way into that root, and that's really important on socket welds that are high pressure for, you know, for power plants. There's been a lot of failures on socket welds. You can pull up reports on them on the net, but part of the problem is walking the cup over a big wire and not penetrating all the way down into that root on a socket weld. So if you dip that, use a smaller wire and dip that root in, dip the wire in and out, and watch the front of the puddle and make sure it goes into the root on a socket weld. That's a good practice. All right, just about through with this one, and we'll give you a look at it of the first pass, the root pass. And there it is. You can see we're going two different directions there, laid down on the table. You see the little scratches the ceramic cup makes on the metal. On certain jobs that I've done, polished stainless steel and things, that really wouldn't be tolerated, so I wouldn't be able to walk and wiggle the cup. But on you know, on most things, it's probably fine. All right, the second pass, a little bit slower, a little bit wider. You may have to adjust the electrodes stick out a little bit because it changes the angle with that. When that weld is growing, it throws the angle off a little bit, and may need to use a little bit shorter stick out to maintain a pretty good angle. So after that first pass is in there, you may need a second pass. The weld may need to be bigger. And second pass, I already showed you a little bit, but without the arc, it looks something like this. I've got a flex head torch here too, and I've bent it. Comes in handy for doing things like this. The flex head that's that body out of the way. Here's another perspective. Just a nice slow pace, tying in each member, leaving the rod in the puddle, and you know, looks something like this when you're done. That's today's lesson on overhead welding, walking the cup. We'll get more, and we'll expand more on this when I get some pipe. Thanks for watching.